Mark, we thank you for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Guy. It is a privilege to be here this morning to speak a little bit about a topic that has a lot of detail to it, and is obviously a fairly complicated tax and spending bill. I want to clarify one thing. I'm not the director of taxes. I'm a director in the tax department at L. Lattimore Black Morgan & Kane. What I'd like to do this morning is, again, talk a little bit about the tax implications of the stimulus bill. As we've all, I'm sure, seen through the news media, et cetera. There's a lot to this bill that's way beyond just taxes. Taxes is a big piece of it. But I will attempt to just go through the tax implications, again, to the best of my ability, and I appreciate the Chamber putting that caveat on the website. I've got about 20 to 30 minutes of material to cover. I know we've got a good hour here together this morning, so while I've saved some time at the end for Q&A, I'm more than happy to take questions during the course of going through these provisions. Certainly that's a lot easier to do with a smaller group, and I welcome questions and comments as we go through. Again, it's nice to be here this morning. The alternative would be sitting at my desk doing tax returns this time of year, so it's a nice break from that. So let's go ahead and get started and take a look at some of the details. We see the news media typically refer to this as the economic stimulus bill or the stimulus package. Actually, the formal name of the bill is the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. Obviously, embedded in the name is some of the intent behind the administration's purpose in pushing forth this initiative to try to help us begin to recover from obviously what is a very difficult economic time right now. I put up the effective date of February 17th, 2009, the day the President signed it, only because, as with almost all, certainly tax bills, that effective date can have some implications in terms of whether a provision applies to you or not. The cost of the bill, $787 billion in spending and tax relief over a 10-year period. There has been some discussion, again, in the news media and mostly in the context of political posturing as to whether or not this spends money sooner rather than later, and whether or not we're going to create the kind of stimulus that I think the administrator wants to create earlier rather than later. If you look at I think it's the Congressional Budget Office, and this is where I got these numbers, timeline, you can kind of add up pretty quickly where the numbers are coming from. $719 billion will be spent over the next 3 years. According to that projection, $783 billion over the next 5 years. So it is fairly front-loaded in terms of when the money is going to be spent. There are some out-year amounts, but they're fairly small. And one interesting thing as well, they talk about $787 billion. In actuality, the bill authorizes the spending of as much as $792.5 billion, and that's the difference between authorization of amounts to be spent versus amounts that are actually appropriated to be spent in the bill. So where's the beef? I think, again, as you look through the details of the package and certainly the projections on where the money is going to be spent, how it's going to be spent, you can break it into 3 categories: discretionary spending, direct spending, and then the tax provisions. I've thrown out just a few numbers. I really picked out the numbers that are greater than $50 billion. There are lots of provisions in here that are smaller than that in terms of overall spending. You can kind of see where those numbers are. Energy and water development, $58 billion. Education, labor, HHS, health and human services, $71 billion. It's interesting, both in the discretionary spending and the direct spending categories, you've got state fiscal amounts, stabilization and relief. Don't ask me what the difference is. I don't really know. But there's a good, $144 billion authorized in state relief, if you will, over the 10-year period within the 2 categories. The other thing I want to point out on this slide, the advertised size of the tax element of this bill is about $288 billion. You saw that number when it was going through the debate. We're going to provide that much relief. In fact, the tax provisions alone are about $214 billion. The other piece of that is this refundable tax credit or other tax number of $74 billion. That's principally refundable tax credit amounts, i.e. people that may not owe taxes but are eligible for some type of a refundable tax credit because of their income level, because of their tax situation. And because you're effectively giving money to those individuals or those taxpayers in the form of a refund, a refundable amount, even though they don't owe tax, they score that in the direct spending, because that's really what it is. It's direct spending versus somehow reducing their tax liability, because in most cases those individuals who file returns don't owe any tax, but they're still entitled to participate in the refundable credit program. In the interest of adding a little bit of levity here, I did a calculation. I don't know how many of you ever watch David Letterman at night occasionally, and he does this segment called Fun Facts. And I thought, well, is there a fun fact embedded in this number someplace? So if my numbers are right, I said, okay, well, how can I kind of visualize how big $787 billion is? I said, okay, well, let's see. There's 240,000 miles from the Earth to the Moon, and that equates to 1,267,200 feet. A dollar bill is about 6 inches long, so I doubled that number. So that's 2.5, I guess, billion 6-inch segments. To go there and back is about twice again that amount, a little over 5 billion 6-inch segments. And so then I divided that number into 787 billion. And so you can take the dollar bills, stretch them end to end, from here to the moon, and go there and back 155 times. And I thought, well, how could we better maybe spend that money?
That is fun.
Yeah, some may say that's a horror fact, not a fun fact. But you know, I guess if 155 times you could maybe laminate them and stretch them side to side and create a highway there and back, and they could, rather than the next iteration of the shuttle, you could drive there and back.
Maybe we get the shuttle to pick some of those bills up.
Yeah. So anyway, it's needless to say, it's a lot of money. Clearly, it's a lot of money. But that's kind of the parameters of the bill in terms of its size. Let's talk a minute about what's in it for us, from a business standpoint and from an individual standpoint. And I'll get into a little bit more detail in just a minute. For businesses, there's some favorable rules. Whether or not you can qualify or not is another question. Of course, the devil's always in the details, and that's why it's very important for individual businesses and their tax advisors to make sure they're looking at these provisions and the details of these provisions to see if they can apply to them. There's a continuation of some favorable property expensing rules that were enacted last year and were reenacted for 2009 in this bill. There's a carryback opportunity for small businesses that, again, many of them are suffering in these economic times. So from a net operating loss standpoint, they've changed the rules in a favorable way to help provide some relief there. Some additional relief in terms of debt forgiveness, again, something that many businesses may be facing right now. Some changes, some very detailed changes in built-in gains for S corporations and sales of small business stock, and there's an expansion of the work opportunity tax credit for a couple of new categories. And finally, there's a number of energy-related provisions, again, consistent with the administration's call for a focus on renewable energy, green energy, some people call it, very detailed provisions. You might want to look at those as well. Obviously, that tends to suggest there's some good news in the bill in the tax provisions for small businesses, but I have to say, at least by one estimate that I looked at, the tax relief for businesses only amounts to about 1% of the overall $787 billion in spending. So certainly I think we'd all like to see more than that, but these provisions are fairly targeted towards smaller businesses, and so you're not going to see a lot of relief up the chain, if you will, for larger organizations.